Okay, wonderful. So, as I mentioned just off the top, I apologize for repeating myself. I've been an admirer of this community, kind of looking outside in for a while now. And I got really excited when Amir started talking about product development specifically within the AI context. And I think that there's a really interesting tension between product development in a software context and product development in an AI context. And much of it relates to what is unique and what is not unique about AI products specifically. The other kind of thread that I'm fascinated by when it comes to the idea maze and why I'm such a big proponent is something like lean startup is, very famous. There's a best-selling book behind it, a bunch of courses, et cetera, et cetera. The idea maze is this kind of weird PDF lecture that's like its fifth result on Google that was kind of given by a venture capitalist. And so it's less well known, but it's extremely powerful in my opinion as a decision-making tool. And so I'm really keen to kind of work through some of the general concepts. And just a couple caveats. This is as scrappy as it gets. So if you are maybe working at, a big company, the culture change that might need to happen to sort of leverage some of these things or might be significant. But if you're thinking about running your own business, this to me is just a highly efficient way to approach product development, and especially for those folks who kind of have a 5-week deadline to produce something as part of the Amir's course. This is a great way to approach this problem. So really quickly, just a couple minutes about myself. First sort of tech gig of note, I was the first hire at Vox Pop Labs. We were a research lab slash company. Our mission was to make the decision most aligned to your values. We're most famous for Vote Compass, which is a fairly popular tool. During my tenure there, we went from about 2 million to 13 million users. After that, I joined the founding team at Delphia as a product manager. In its first iteration, my tool that I was responsible for was to help people pick their ideal university program with AI. We had 0 users for that tool, zero. It remains one of the more painful learning experiences I've ever had, but it's meaningful to me to note and to not shy away from. From there, we pivoted into a mission around earning wealth from your data. I was responsible for the consumer-facing side of helping people understand how quantitative traders use data to make better investing returns and how they could do that for themselves. During the time I was there, we had essentially gone from 0 to 10,000 users pre-launch. There's since been a pivot after I've left. That's kind of my tenure at Delphia. And lastly, in December, I founded a company called Guided. Our mission is to massively expand the supply of high quality personalized career support. And the results are TBD. We're in the experimentation phase. We're trying many different things. If you look at my LinkedIn, you're going to notice a lot of different experiments, a lot of different sites and things of that nature. But very excited about the mission, very energized by the problem space. And so my goal for this talk really is, if you're working on a new idea, you'll always know what questions to answer next. And so if there's one big takeaway, I want you to imagine moments where in your product development journey, it's like, oh, I don't know what to do next. My metric for success would be something along the lines of, you just don't encounter that anymore because you've sort of got a framework and an organization of how to proceed. Whether or not I'm actually able to do that, who knows? But that is kind of the intention of this framework. And so my preferred framework for achieving this and what keeps me going is called the idea maze. And so here's a visualization of it. And if you can imagine, someone in the bottom left here decides, okay, I've got an idea for music, movies, doing that on the internet. And you can imagine they've already thought, they're already counting their billions of dollars. They're already thinking about detailed requirements for what their MVP is going to be like and things of that nature. What the idea maze is so important for an understanding is it basically places, it forces the product developer to think of their tool in a historical and competitive context. And you do that with a couple of core elements. So each of these little splits here are critical decisions that a company could make. So for example, BitTorrent decided to go open source, everyone else decided to go closed source. A handful of companies decided to go for a free option. Many decided to go for paid. The method by which people paid, iTunes decided per download, subscription models were considered by others. And to give you a sense of this is a constantly evolving ecosystem. So when this was written in 2013, iTunes was king. And the person presenting this clearly felt that the pricing model here is the key distinguisher. I would argue now that if you're going to move this little, anoint a music streaming service, you're probably going to do Spotify. And so there's a dynamicy to how you think about the critical decisions that all of these competitors are going to make that you want to have always front of mind as you're thinking about what you're doing as a product developer. And so the definition of a good idea is essentially a detailed path through this maze, right? What are the first 10 or 12 critical decisions that are going to define our business going forward? And this means that, you don't necessarily stop when you come up with an idea. It's more along the lines of you come up with an idea and then immediately move to identifying what your critical assumptions are and validating those and moving through it quickly. And so don't fuss too much about the detail here. We're going to revisit what this looks like a couple of times, but the critical elements I want here is to emphasize just out of the gate are your idea is probably not so unique that no competitors exist. So we'll just start there. But all of your competitors are making decisions in a given historical context, and you want to be aware of those and chart your own course so that you can find something that's ultimately distinguishing. So critical to the idea maze is this idea of a state machine. So if you think about, you're going to essentially take not just one idea, but several, and feed them into this state machine. And there's a bunch of different steps, right? And they range from a napkin sketch to a mock-up to an area of market research to a program to a product to business to profits. And I can imagine that, couldn't help it over here, the 5-week deadline for this project. I can imagine that many of you are already in the program phase. You're already thinking about, how am I going to implement something this quickly? And there's a temptation to skip over some of the most high leverage opportunities that exist in this funnel. And so this triangle is meant to represent the sort of number of ideas that you're feeding into this machine, right? And so you're willing to entertain a lot of ideas at the napkin sketch phase. But as you get to kind of the program and product business profits phase, right, there's just going to be very, very few that are able to survive all the questions that are necessary to kind of get through this. And I hope that this feels just intuitively true. And I'll kind of leave it at that, but fundamentally, really want you to just imagine you're going to be taking every idea you have, feeding it into this state machine, and continuously learning, moving up and down the state machine as you kind of de-risk each of your assumptions. And that's sort of the fundamental mindset that you need to be in to do this, to use this method. Whoops. So just for a bit of agenda setting, I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on the napkin sketch mock-up market research. That's going to be our first section. And then the second section, we're going to spend some time on the program and product because I think there's some interesting tensions there. We're not really going to spend a ton of time on the business and profit side because I don't want to keep you here until midnight. But I'm probably, if we're going to go into a fair degree of detail on each of these, I'm probably going to spend more time on a napkin sketch than any presenter you've ever heard about. And so hopefully that doesn't make you go running for the hills. But so really the core question you're looking to ask at each stage is, does this precise idea deserve further investment? And it's really up to the idea to prove to you that it warrants more of your time, energy, and moving into another phase in the state machine. And this is kind of the critical quote of the whole framework. So any successful product team has not one good idea, but a profusion of good ideas that lie abandoned at the beginning of the state machine. Moreover, many more napkin ideas have fatal flaws that only become apparent in the implementation stage. And it's only through actually pushing ideas through the state machine that one realizes whether they are good or not. And so it's a very active discovery, right? There's this fundamentally different questions that you're pushing through. It's this to me is kind of the critical moment, the critical idea central in the idea maze. And you might want to contrast that with something like lean startup or a simple, build, measure, learn loop, right? Which demonstrates to me to be a very sort of tidy, safe process. This process is chaotic, and it's intentionally chaotic because you are essentially throwing a lot of ideas through something and not being afraid to leave things that aren't working. So you've got kind of a couple dimensions of each stage. The first is the cost. I've got my highly precise scale here of $0 to a lot of dollars. But basically you're going from, a sketch is very inexpensive all the way down to building a profitable enterprise is super expensive. Similarly, the riskiness of your assumptions that you're willing to entertain should go down over time. And so if you think about a napkin sketch is so inexpensive, try anything, right? Cat, human, neural links, whatever, right? Try whatever you can and see if you can push it through to the next stage. But what you're going to find is as you go through a process of taking on your riskiest assumptions, by the time you've gotten to a product or a business, things are going to feel pretty safe, or should feel pretty safe unless you've skipped a step. And so I really like this term of just like unbothered by basic reality. Like at the napkin sketch phase, sketch anything out, just try anything. But just make sure that you're really rigorous in how you think about moving to the next stage. And so your basic principle here is that your investment in this idea can rise as the summed risk of your assumptions drops, right? And so as each of your assumptions goes down, you can then start to think about building up your investment in this idea. And then the second principle here is that each of these stages, from napkin sketch on the down to profit, answers fundamentally different questions. And we're going to kind of go into each of those in detail. So I have one quibble with this framework, and it's that the starting point is an idea and not research into a problem. And I think that that is an accurate diagnosis of how a lot of us think. It's certainly true for me that I'll get woken up in the middle of the night and have an idea and have to figure out what to do with it. An equally viable way to approach product development is to pick a market that you like and talk to those customers and generate ideas from there. And in that case, just imagine that you have, one item at the very top of this that is feeding into these ideas, right? So as you're talking to customers and sort of building an imagination for how they're working, you're still starting with napkin sketches. Whatever ideas they present to you, whatever pain points they present to you, those are all napkin sketches. But if I had to quibble with this idea, I would say that consider just simply doing research first as opposed to generating ideas. Okay, here is the stretch of napkin sketch. So napkin sketch, time required about a minute. The riskiness of your assumptions, as I said, maximal, right? Try anything that feels not crazy. Your cost is going to be about 2 cents, so not a crazy amount of money. And your output here can be a literal napkin sketch. It can be, you know, a Google Draw image. It can be sketches in your notebook, whatever. I would encourage you to think about it as a story map. So think through, you know, what is kind of the customer journey and things like that, and just move quickly. You don't need to overthink the output here. The output's not going to solve anyone's problems. But as quickly as you can, start generating a list of core assumptions, right? What needs to be true for this idea to work? And this is really the critical value of this stage, right? Is getting to that list of core assumptions as quickly as possible. And not to put too fine a point on it, but if you create a story map, each one of those elements in that story map is by definition an assumption, right? So you can think through each of those stages from a desirability standpoint, right? Do people want this? From a viability standpoint, from a feasibility standpoint. That's going to kind of get this document, this assumptions document going. The core questions you're looking to answer at the napkin sketch phase are, right, what am I even talking about? What is this idea? Can I express it to another person or to myself in a way that's clear and not completely confusing? What problem does this solve? Which is, you know, one click down from the idea and is a much better place to focus on. And are there any obvious fatal flaws, right? Have you imagined a computational model that breaks the laws of physics? Have you thought of a business that breaks every IP law in the books, right? Like those are the kinds of things, kinds of mindsets that you want to be thinking about. Consumer behavior is not always a fatal flaw, but is an area that you've got to be prepared to test, right? And so if you think about if an idea fundamentally changes how someone spends 4 or 5 hours of their day, it's got to deliver a crazy amount of value, right? If it is 1 minute of their week, then maybe you're probably in a good space to continue. So that's how I think about changing consumer behavior in terms of a fatal flaw at the napkin sketch phase. And again, most important, broken record, what are all the major assumptions we're making in this, right? What are all the questions that this idea has generated that have to be true in order for this to be a profitable initiative? Irrelevant questions. What VC should I call first? What are detailed requirements for the MVP, right? We've basically just established, you know, what is this fundamental idea? And speaking personally, this is one of my favorite things to do in life. So I feel very good generating ideas. And it's really important to, you know, be objective and be a little sobering about where you actually are in this phase. So the methods you might want to deploy in the napkin sketch phase, right? You might want to get some feedback from smart peers, especially on fatal flaws and major assumptions. I wouldn't hesitate to talk to anyone who you think can diagnose a problem really quickly and maybe provide a little extra insight. Just be mindful that they too are going to be making assumptions about your idea, right? So you may have a person who says that this idea is impossible for reason X, Y, Z, and those may just be a different assumption set, right? And so you just want to be thoughtful about any discouraging advice that you're getting at this stage. What's more important is, as quickly as possible, interviews with customers specifically on the problem space, right? So how quickly can I start to talk to people about the problem I think I'm solving and how are they solving it? And, you know, it's probably a whole other lecture to get into how to do customer interviewing well and how to do it at a stage where you've already got a solution in mind, which is highly problematic from a research standpoint. But I would want you to, as quickly as you can, start to think through how are people, do people actually have the problem I'm solving, and how are they currently solving it, and how bad is it for them? So you want to get out and talk to people as quickly as possible, right? Sets of 5, ideally, and in as kind of non-directive way as possible. So that kind of concludes the napkin sketch stage, right? So we've defined our idea, we've shown it to a couple people that we respect, and they've come up with some assumptions that has changed our assumptions list a little bit. And we've spoken to some customers who indeed have said that like they have a problem in the area that we're looking to solve. This is great. We can now sort of move on. So in the mock-up, you know, you're looking at kind of 1 to 2 days of work. The riskiness of assumptions here you're willing to work on, again, can be very high. At the end of this output, you're going to wind up with essentially one assumption that's been weakly validated. That's your best case scenario here. So don't be afraid to test a lot of things and to test them quickly. Cost of this phase, again, should not be high. A tool to build a prototype like Figma is free. You may need to pay people to talk to you. That's fine. That shouldn't cost you more than $100. And so your output here, right, is a prototype of a single major use case, right? What is the biggest problem that you've identified in your conversation? And what is the single major use case you can build to that? And your quality benchmark here is not build a mind-blowing product that people use. It's can they understand it, right? If you're sitting on a call with them, talking through what's going on, can they understand what they're looking at? Can they imagine how they might use it in real life? So for example, I made a rule for myself that my prototypes can never be in color. So I just do black and white prototypes because it helps me go faster. I don't have to worry about UI decisions. And I frankly don't allow myself to by kind of taking this black and white approach. And so your benchmark here again is just understandability, right? We're running an experiment, and the only way you're going to reject the results of this experiment is if you feel confident that people didn't get what was happening. The core questions you're looking to solve here, right? Does this solve your customer's problem? First and foremost. A bonus, or to get a little more detailed, can an AI product with average performance solve this problem? And I included average performance here just because I always believe that planning cynically at these stages is helpful. And so, you know, it's entirely possible that your product team are all stars, and this is overly cautious, but I would encourage you to plan cynically regardless. In cases where the mock-up didn't quite land, an important question that doesn't get asked often enough is your customer segment too broad? So is the problem you've defined just too general for customers to immediately feel the pain point? And, you know, maybe to give a quick example, in an early iteration for Guided, we essentially wanted to build a community for people, we called it, who are dealing with bad situations at work. Well, it turned out that like our customer segment was way too broad there, and the problem definition was too fuzzy. And so when we decompose the problem into something like a community for people with managers who are micromanagers, there's sort of an intuitive, you know, our total market is smaller there, but the problem set is much more well-defined and recognizable in the customer's eyes. And so that's kind of an option, you know, in product development land, it's also often called niching down. And so if your mock-up doesn't land, it may be that you need to target a smaller, more specific set of customers. Another critical question that I think is important, particularly for AI products, is what problems does your solution create? So if you have a real problem with edge cases in your model, or if you think you're going to be dealing in a situation where something like 60% accuracy is a great outcome, that's cool. Just recognize that you've now created a body of work for that remaining 40%, and be really mindful about how you handle that. So that's just kind of a mentality that I like to put people in. You don't need to solve every single problem right out of the gate. You just want to be aware of the problems your product is creating. And again, this is something that can go into your assumptions list. So methods, again, in-depth qualitative interviews with your customer segment. I encourage you guys to think about the targeting variables for people that you're talking to. I encourage you to think about what you might pay to attract people. Obviously, the higher your interviewing budget, the more people get in, which means the more specific you can get with your customer segments. And a relative splurge in this phase is going to be much more efficient than having to rewrite a few days worth of code because you got a set of features wrong. And your reasons to proceed to the next stage here really are you've presented a clear solution to a painful problem they've experienced recently. And I would encourage you all to not cut corners when it comes to that. There's so many products on the market that are vitamins and not painkillers, right? They're things that are nice to have, but really don't solve the worst part of someone's week. It isn't something that someone experiences on a regular basis. And the best products really take away the worst part of someone's life, right, in some capacity or another. And then the other reason to proceed is, your target customer is excited now. So you're showing this to people and you can sort of feel the enthusiasm in these interviews. Okay, so third phase, you've got your mock-up, you've got your product, you're feeling good about what it is. So if your idea is good, it's probably someone else has tried it, right? And the point of market research is to understand where you sit relative to everyone else who's tried it. And so time required here, 1 to 4 days. Again, the riskiness of assumptions here is very, very high. And the cost of this phase is low, right? This could be Googling stuff. It could be trying out your competitors' offerings. Like, this is not something that should invoke a big capital expense. So the output here is really a defensible case on the size of your market. So you've gone through this mock-up phase, you've solved the problem for 5 people. Well, how many people are out there, right? How big can this be? If you are dealing in a tiny niche market, that's great. You just might want to counteract that with building something where maybe a small percentage of a giant market. That's the type of decision making that you want to be making in this phase. And your other output here really is a history of the problem space and a compelling answer to why now, right? What is it about right now that someone is going to try your idea, that it's finally going to work, right? Assume someone has tried this before. And if you think about, there are many models of the iPod before it existed, right? So what was it about Apple's positioning, its go-to-market, and the specific time and the specific technology that was in place at that time that made it such a success? And those are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about. And you want to be able to tell a really compelling story about why the decisions you're making are going to lead you to a place where other attempts haven't been able to do. So your methods here, you want to do Fermi estimation for market sizing. So just use logic, right? Take a look at total size of the role that exists if you're targeting a specific market. Think about how competitive that space, what percentage of the market does an incumbent currently have, things of that nature, right? And you just want to kind of build a logical case for this is what success looks like. And this can get pretty detailed, pretty in the weeds. Unfortunately, we're not going to devote a lot more time to this. But it is kind of an essential component of thinking through how big this can be. And this especially is something where if you're looking to take investment, VCs are going to spend particular time on your logic here. Because ultimately, if you're coming to them and you're saying, oh yeah, I've got product market fit, they're saying, cool, how big can this be? And they're going to rely on this Fermi estimation to kind of make that assessment. So you also can look at it from a bottom-up standpoint. So you can look for evidence of deal sizes and annual budgets dedicated to your problem. So if you're building a solution that you're building a solution for a SaaS company and there's no obvious budget line for what you'd be solving, that could be a problem, right? Whereas let's say 1% of the total annual recruiting budget for all Fortune 500 companies, which is going to be in the, it's going to be a huge number, is kind of a good place to be, right? And the reason I say evidence here is that, I don't believe in market rationality. You really would be surprised by how big certain domains, how big and well-financed certain domains of industries are, and how underfunded and competitive other possibly more valuable domains are. So I would just do yourself a favor and do some research and try to find invoices, try to find budget lines, et cetera, et cetera. The SEC here and the filings for companies in your domain, if there are any public ones, is a great resource for you here. And so then the last component that I talked about when we're talking about telling a compelling history about the problem space you're trying to solve, really what you're looking for here is, blog posts, commentaries, direct research on incumbents, so use their tools, see what decisions they're making, try to see if their founders have blogs or they've talked about, what's worked and what hasn't worked. A really good resource for avoiding survivorship bias is go through the Y Combinator cohorts, see if anyone has tried your idea before, see if you can track down those founders and talk to them, things like that. So again, all we're looking to do here is approach the problem with the mentality that other people have tried to solve this before, and what did they try? And if you can answer that question really well and still come out with confidence about your idea, you're in a really good spot. So reasons to proceed from this stage is you've made a reasonably logical case that your cynically estimated revenue, which is that kind of Fermi math that I've described, is somewhere like 100 to 1,000x the cost of development, even if you assume a competitor moves into your market at some point. So that is kind of the case that you want to build for yourself. And I would say that I present this as a tool for making a rational decision. If you are looking to raise money, it's easy to change your estimates to make it look better, to secure a better deal, if you really want to go that route or whatever it may be. But for you right now, you're looking to think about how do I deploy my time in as optimal way as possible. And so I would project cynically and have a high bar for your kind of revenue relative to your cost. So, skip that. Okay. So I want to come back to this notion of the idea maze, right? And so this again, kind of, if you look at this again with fresh eyes, I think you can kind of see the history that's playing out in this very broad industry, right? So initially, you know, it was music, movies was essentially purely a pirated activity. So you had these decisions around open source and closed source, and revenue wasn't really part of the game. You know, this kind of hidden where in these free options, you've got a couple sort of dead incumbents, right? Napster, Kazaa, these companies were huge. They're not around anymore. And largely the reason is there was nothing you could do on those platforms and nothing people wanted to do on those platforms that wasn't illegal. Now, there are services out there where there's tons of illegal things happening, tons of IP infringement, right? You can listen to basically any album you want on YouTube, but there's also other things to do. And so, you know, that is a decision that is baked into these products that has seemed to lead to each of these companies being around, being a little more successful. And then you layer that onto, you know, Vimeo's got sort of a freemium model and they're kind of chugging along, whereas YouTube has gone purely the ad route and they're extremely successful, obviously. So you kind of get a sense of like, what were the big decisions that were made along the way in this general problem space that put YouTube in a highly dominant position. Meanwhile, as I've said, this is a highly, highly dynamic process. And so in 2013, iTunes was at the top. I would argue that that's shifted, right? Consumer tastes have shifted much towards the subscription model. So, you know, Spotify is doing much better. Netflix is doing much better. Even Amazon, right? Like these places is like, this is kind of where consumer taste has moved. They kind of make this assumption of like Hollywood content versus original non-Hollywood content. I think this is a little dated too, but the basic principle here is just map out the critical decisions that your competitors are making. Which ones do you think are most important? And once you do that, you can kind of get a sense of how you might navigate this space. How might a new, you know, how might the next Spotify or Netflix approach the problem space? What might make them successful? So just a quick gut check. The idea mock-up market research stage is hard. It's really hard. So you can cycle through this dozens and dozens of times and not find an idea that survives this. And I just want to tell you from a personal standpoint, congratulations on being rational, even when it maximally sucks. Keep grinding. Don't drop your standards. And I don't know if I've got a future as an inspirational speaker, but I really want to emphasize, like, this is a very difficult part of the process. And if you skip steps, you're just making the cost of being wrong much higher. So if you're going through this initial cycle and you haven't even written a line of code yet, stick with it. Stick with it until you're feeling really confident about your idea through these 3 steps. So we've gone through this painful process of napkin, sketch, mock-up, market research. We're finally at the program phase. Finally, the coders in the room can write some code, which is always challenging for engineers, and I'm sorry. So the program, right, your time requirement, now your estimates are getting really big, right? It could be as short as 5 weeks. It could be really long. I don't know. But again, the riskiness of your assumptions here is still really high, right? You haven't built anything that's going to solve a problem. And now you're in a doubly challenging spot in that your cost to actually deliver value is high. So these are like high confidence estimates that you want to be putting forward. So your output here, you know, clean code for most of your major use cases. I put all, but I think that's a bit of an oversell. So let's just call it most. And a benchmark that the VC firm that this guy developed said, you know, around 80% accuracy for AI programs. Again, I don't want to be too prescriptive with this, what I would say is like, you're not in the weeds on your edge cases, right? You've built a program that works, whatever is a decent benchmark for the problem set you're trying to solve. And you're not, killing yourself spending a ton of hours trying to figure out all of the different edge cases. So methods you're looking to use here, right? End-to-end code for these major use cases, usually in a hello world style UI, right? So nothing fancy in terms of design or anything like that. Just anything that works that someone can move through and get value from. And your other, this should be an output, I apologize. Another output that you want here is just a constant and honest revision of costs and effort. So as you're diving into the program state, I think that there's a really negative tendency in product teams for product managers to ask for an estimate, engineers to feel like they're beholden to that estimate, and maybe a renegotiation happens, maybe it doesn't, maybe it just kind of goes on. Again, our goal here is to make a rational choice. And if on Monday you thought that a certain problem set was going to take you, a day, and on Tuesday you think it's 100 days, right? Like that needs to be accounted for, right? Because again, the core question that pertains to is the bottom one. Does projected revenue still exceed our more accurate costing by 100 to 1000x? So if your project has quadrupled in cost or, gone up by a factor of 10 or whatever, the sort of fundamental moment that you initially got into this stage is no longer true. So you need to go back to the drawing board. So that's kind of how I want you to think about costing, right? I want you to think about it in a very, very dynamic way. And I completely accept that in many established institutions, this conversation is super fraught and it's really challenging. And so it may just be something where you agree to do it with yourself on your own side projects and kind of let the insanity of your enterprise run its course. Or maybe it's something that you advocate for in smaller ways. It's a super challenging problem. Other core questions on the program state, right? Did we discover any unseen fatal flaws in implementation, right? We don't want to punish new discovery, just like we don't want to litigate a napkin sketch into death, right? There's just certain things you're not going to know until you try to do it. And it's really important to keep these kind of unseen fatal flaws in their place. So that's just one thing that I would really emphasize. You don't beat yourself up over not anticipating some technical solution that you hadn't thought about, right? Don't get the order of operations wrong. And then the other core question, right? How do we get this remaining 10, 19, whatever percent of accuracy? I don't think there's a ton to say here other than, the established wisdom, in kind of VC-driven AI investing is you can hit diminishing returns pretty quickly by aiming for greater accuracy. And I'm just gonna say that we don't need to defend or litigate that. Use cases differ, et cetera, et cetera. But just know that the way it's kind of perceived in certain product circles is if an engineer comes to us and asks for 6 months to try and solve, an extra 5% of accuracy or whatever, that's automatically viewed as a diminishing return. So just consider it and try to see it from that lens. So reasons to stop. And if you remember before, right, we were talking about reasons to proceed in our first 3 steps. Now you're probably pretty invested in this, right? Like you've done your due diligence. This idea went from being kind of smart and exciting in an abstract way to like really exciting in a way that you've justified to yourself. And so now I want you to start having conversations with yourself about why would I stop doing this? And it's important to switch that because we're all humans and we all love what we build and we all want to be smart and successful, right? So reframe this conversation into like, why would I stop investing in this? So one is like that there's no clear path to a fault tolerant UI. And so if you've got, 80% accuracy and it takes forever to deal with the 20% inaccuracies, you've got a major problem. If you were dealing with something like, Google's Gmail's autocomplete, where the worst case impact of an inaccurate prediction there is I just keep typing and I finish my sentence. Great. Accuracy is not the primary thing there, right? The user experience in dealing with errors really helps Google's product adoption there. So the other one to consider, right? No clear technical path to remaining 10 to 19%. This one, like, consider this one and the one above it working in tandem, right? If the answer is no to both of those, perhaps you have a problem. If the answer is yes to one of those, particularly if your technical path is maybe not crazy expensive, you're probably good to proceed. And then the other one, right, is acquiring data, right? So no inexpensive path to acquiring data needed to remain for this remaining 10 and 19%. And, you know, Ada and Intercom, again, both solved this one in the same way, right? They recruited their they recruited their customers to collect their data for them. Totally viable way to do it. You know, there's other approaches and they tend to get expensive pretty quickly, but just like, this is the mentality you want to be in. If you can get yes to one of these or to two of these, you're in pretty good shape. So this is, you know, this Andreessen Horowitz firm kind of put together their version of a decision matrix on an AI-driven idea maze at the program stage, right, at the MVP stage. And so they really look at, like, how can you get this next 10 to 20%? And if you can't get it, right, you're basically stuck with creating this fault-tolerant UX or UI. If you can get it, they encourage you to narrow your domain, right? They encourage you to reduce the problem set significantly because they are really concerned about the price of getting data, right? And so if you think about, they look to invest in AI startups, and most of the ones they're finding aren't thinking through what it's going to cost to acquire the data to be successful on a startup budget. And whether or not that's true in your use case or every use case or whatever it may be, you know, I don't know. I wouldn't pretend to, but this is how a lot of these problems are viewed, right? If your pitch to VCs is something like, oh yeah, we're going to, you know, build this model and then get 100,000 users, and then we're going to have a ton of data and we're going to be great. That's good. That's a challenging case to make. So just keep that in mind. And, you know, honestly, like, there's been, if you don't want to go the narrow domain route, they also kind of recommend you don't build an independent startup, right? They recommend that you go to a big institution that has a lot of funding and can kind of sustain what you're trying to do. So this is, I don't necessarily love this framework. I would consider it a suggestion. I think the way they've put it forward is maybe a little simplistic, but if it's helpful in terms of, like, mapping out the decision system here, you know, by all means use it. So if we've gone past the program phase, we're now in product, right? The kind of last stage that we're really going to devote a lot of time to. And so here you're talking about your output, right? Most use cases are cleanly coded. You've got decent UI, what I would say is great copywriting. And by great, I mean, like, problem set and initial customer really well defined, right? In the way that, like, most of the challenges, most of the decisions we talked about with Ada and with Intercom almost operated at the copywriting level, right? And those can be really good distinguishers for what you're ultimately trying to do. And so I would use that as a bar of quality. And just a simple go-to-market strategy, right? No need to overthink this, but just, like, how are you going to get your first few customers and what's plan B and C? And now the methods that you have available to you, right? Qualitative interviews with active users. So you're no longer showing them a mock-up, right? They're emailing you customer support tickets. You're pulling them off of whatever system they're using and giving them a discount because they, so you can spend 45 minutes with them talking about their product. And for the first time, you actually have quantitative user data, specifically acquisition, retention, and referral. And so like now we're firmly in like, we've built a product, lean startup business, like lean startup rules can apply here, right? Build, measure, learn, et cetera, et cetera. Like you're in a good state where a lot of the accepted knowledge about what to do is really relevant. And I would actually, you know, we're not going to dive too much further beyond this because I think that the true value of the idea maze and the mindset it imposes is actually at the earlier stages of this, right? And so I would just say, if it's not obvious or if you haven't heard it before, you know, the benchmark for an early stage product, right, is great retention. So if you have a set of assumptions or a set of hypotheses, and you know, some relate to how people are going to refer, and some relate to the ads that you're going to build, et cetera, just pay special attention to the ones that are going to keep your customers around for longer. So, core questions, right? Does our retention exceed industry benchmarks? Why or why not? How would you feel if you could no longer use our product? This is like a famous question, kind of similar to Net Promoter Score. And what you're basically trying to say is, if I took this away from my existing customers, how disappointed would they be? And a classic example is Slack had a really difficult time acquiring users way back in the day because no one knew what the hell it was. But once people were using it, if they asked them a question of how would you feel if you could no longer use it, 43% of them said they'd be very disappointed. That's a sign of great retention, right? 4 out of 10 customers would be like literally, you know, extremely disappointed if they could no longer use that product. You've built something great. Another thing to keep an eye on is how's organic growth. Not the end all be all by any stretch of the imagination, but if word of mouth is getting around, then you're kind of in a good stage. Reasons to stop, there's really only 2: bad retention and lack of confidence in your remaining retention hypotheses, right? If people aren't using it and you kind of look at your backlog of ideas that you have, the assumptions that you have, and you feel like these aren't really going to move the needle, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board. And really, like, if you think about, again, the example of Slack, right? Their acquisition was challenged. That's okay, right? Because their retention was great. So things like acquisition, referral, even revenue in certain environments, maybe not in the maybe not in like the post-COVID investment environment, but those things are just secondary to retention.